The grand ballroom of Whitmore Palace glittered under the light of 1,000 crystals, each chandelier casting dancing shadows across the marble floors. King Alexander stood near the entrance, his silver hair distinguished in the warm glow, watching as guests filed in for the annual autumn charity gala. His eyes, sharp despite his 72 years, scanned the room with the practiced ease of a monarch who had spent decades reading crowds and sensing undercurrents of tension. The evening had started like any other royal gathering. Ambassadors mingled with philanthropists, business leaders exchanged pleasantries with artists, and the cream of society moved through the space like a carefully choreographed ballet. Alexander adjusted his military medals, a habit he developed over the years when something fell amiss, though he couldn't quite place what was troubling him tonight. Queen Margaret entered through the side door, her emerald gown sweeping the floor as she moved with practiced grace. At 68, she still commanded attention, though Alexander noticed the slight hesitation in her step, the way her hand briefly touched the doorframe for support. The years had been kind to her, but time spared no one, not even queens. The Swedish ambassador is asking about the trade discussions, Margaret murmured as she reached his side, her voice low enough that only he could hear. I told him you'd find him after the opening remarks. Alexander nodded, but his attention had already shifted. Princess Catherine had just entered from the main staircase, and, even in a room full of elegance, she stood apart. At 38, Catherine possessed that rare combination of beauty and warmth that made her beloved by the public. Her rose-gold gown complemented her complexion perfectly, and her smile seemed genuine as she greeted the Archbishop's wife. But it wasn't Catherine who made Alexander's blood run cold. It was what he saw glittering at Margaret's throat as she turned to greet the French cultural attaché. The sapphire necklace caught the light, sending blue fire across the room, and Alexander's mind reeled with recognition. The Midnight Star, as the palace staff called it, with its perfect salon sapphire surrounded by diamonds in a delicate platinum setting. He had given that necklace to Catherine for her 35th birthday, had watched her tears of joy as she opened the velvet box. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though Alexander's expression remained neutral. Decades of royal training kept his face impassive even as his mind raced. How had Margaret come to be wearing Catherine's necklace? The younger woman stood not 20 feet away, her own neck adorned with a simple pearl choker, clearly unaware that her sapphire treasure graced another's throat. Alexander, Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts. The ambassador? In a moment, he managed, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. He watched Catherine laugh at something the Duke of Marlborough said, her hand briefly touching her throat in a gesture he recognized. She did that when she was nervous, when she felt underdressed or uncertain. Did she know? Had she noticed? The Chancellor approached, requiring Alexander's attention for introductions to a visiting dignitary. As he performed the familiar ritual of royal small talk, his mind continued to process what he had seen. The necklace was unmistakable. He had personally selected it from the royal jeweler, had spent hours discussing the design, ensuring the sapphire was flawless, that the setting would complement Catherine's delicate features. Across the room, Margaret moved through the crowd with her usual poise, seemingly oblivious to the storm she had created. The necklace caught the light with every turn of her head, a beacon that drew Alexander's eye again and again. How many others had noticed? The palace was full of sharp eyes and sharper tongues. By morning, the whispers would begin if they hadn't already. Lady Victoria Pemberton, the palace's social secretary, appeared at his elbow with practiced timing. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister has arrived. Shall I arrange the receiving line? Alexander nodded absently, his gaze still tracking between Margaret and Catherine. They hadn't been in the same vicinity yet, but it was only a matter of time. The gala would require them to interact, to stand together for photographs, to present the unified front that royal protocol demanded. Victoria, he said quietly, ensure that the Queen and Princess Catherine are seated at opposite ends during dinner. If Lady Pemberton found a request unusual, her face didn't show it. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll adjust the arrangements immediately. The orchestra began playing a waltz, and couples moved onto the dance floor. Alexander watched Margaret accept the Duke of Edinburgh's hand, the sapphires catching the light as she spun. Each flash felt like an accusation, a betrayal made manifest in precious stones and platinum. Catherine stood near the terrace doors now, engaged in conversation with the director of the National Gallery. She gestured animatedly, passionate about whatever artistic topic they discussed. This was Catherine at her best, Alexander thought, when she forgot about protocol and simply engaged with the world around her. It was what made her such an asset to the crown, her ability to connect with people genuinely. The contrast with Margaret couldn't be sharper. Where Catherine was warm, Margaret was regal. Where Catherine bent protocol to comfort a crying child or hug a grieving widow, Margaret maintained the proper royal distance. They were different types of royal women, each valuable in their own way, but only one wore the sapphires tonight. Your Majesty? The Swedish ambassador had found him, eager to discuss trade relations and Baltic shipping routes. Alexander forced himself to focus, to play the role of engaged monarch even as his personal world tilted on its axis. This was the burden of kingship, to prioritize duty over personal drama, to maintain composure when everything inside screamed for confrontation. As he discussed tonnage and tariffs, Alexander's mind wandered to 3 years ago, to Catherine's birthday celebration in the private dining room. She had been radiant that night, surrounded by family, her laugh filling the space with joy. When she opened his gift, her hands had trembled. "It's too much," she had whispered, but her eyes had shone with happiness. "Nothing is too much for you," he had replied, meaning every word. Catherine had brought light back into the palace after years of increasing coldness between him and Margaret, not in any inappropriate way. Catherine was absolutely devoted to his son James, and their marriage was one of the few bright spots in recent royal history. But her presence had reminded Alexander of what warmth felt like, what genuine emotion could do to transform the sterile protocols of palace life. Now Margaret wore Catherine's necklace like a trophy, a claim staked in sapphires and diamonds. The message was clear even if the method was puzzling. How had she obtained it? Catherine wasn't careless with her jewelry, especially not with pieces of such personal significance. The ambassador finally retreated, satisfied with promises of future discussions. Alexander seized the moment to move through the crowd, ostensibly mingling, but actually positioning himself to better observe the unfolding drama. He paused to compliment the Duchess of York on her charitable work, all while keeping Margaret in his peripheral vision. Prince James appeared at his father's side, looking handsome in his naval dress uniform. At 40, Alexander's eldest son had grown into his role as heir apparent, balancing military service with royal duties admirably. "Father, have you seen Catherine? She was looking for you earlier." Alexander's chest tightened. "What did she want?" "Something about the necklace you gave her. She seemed upset but wouldn't say why." James frowned, following his father's gaze across the room. "Is everything all right?" Before Alexander could respond, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd near the main staircase. Both men turned to see Catherine frozen at the top of the stairs, her face pale as marble. Her eyes were fixed on Margaret, who stood at the bottom of the stairs, the sapphire necklace impossible to miss from that angle. Time seemed to slow as the two women regarded each other. Catherine's hand went to her throat, to the simple pearls that seemed suddenly inadequate. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, a gesture Alexander recognized as defiance. Around them, guests pretended not to notice the sudden tension, but conversations faltered and the orchestra seemed to play too loudly in the growing silence. "Christ," James muttered under his breath, starting forward. Alexander caught his son's arm, holding him back. "Not yet," he warned quietly. "Let them handle it." Catherine descended the stairs with remarkable composure, each step measured and graceful despite what must have been turmoil inside. She had learned well in her years as a royal, Alexander noted with pride. When she reached the bottom, she and Margaret stood facing each other, two queens in all, but title one past her prime and one approaching hers. "Your Majesty," Catherine said, dropping into a perfect curtsy that somehow managed to convey both respect and reproach. What a stunning necklace. I've always admired sapphires. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. Thank you, my dear. Sometimes we must wear our finest pieces to truly honor the occasion. Indeed, Catherine replied, her voice steady. Though I've always believed the finest pieces are those given with love, worn with permission. The surrounding crowd had given up any pretense of not watching. Lady Pemberton looked ready to faint, her carefully orchestrated evening crumbling before her eyes. The photographer from the approved press pool raised his camera instinctively, then lowered it at a sharp look from security. Alexander moved then, crossing the space with purposeful strides. Ladies, he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the throne. Perhaps we should begin the formal proceedings. Both women turned to him, and for a moment he saw everything in their eyes. Margaret's defiance mixed with something else. Triumph? Vindication? Catherine's hurt and confusion were carefully masked but visible to someone who knew her well. And beneath it all, he sensed the earthquake this moment would trigger throughout the palace, throughout the monarchy itself. Of course, Margaret said smoothly, placing her hand on his offered arm. The gesture was possessive, a queen claiming her king, and the sapphires sparkled with each movement. Shall we, darling? Alexander had no choice but to escort her toward the dais, leaving Catherine standing alone at the bottom of the stairs. James quickly moved to offer his wife his arm, but the damage was done. The battle lines had been drawn in sapphires and spite, and everyone in the ballroom knew it. As Alexander took his place for the opening remarks, the weight of his crown felt heavier than usual. He looked out at the assembled guests, at the glittering surface of aristocratic society, and wondered how many of them sensed the palace foundations shaking beneath their feet. The speech he had prepared suddenly seemed inadequate for the moment. How did one speak of charity and unity when his own house was dividing before the kingdom's eyes? But this was what kings did. They endured, they performed, they held the center, even when everything threatened to spin apart. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced authority. Welcome to Whitmore Palace. As he spoke the familiar words about service and dedication, his eyes found Catherine in the crowd. She stood with James, her head high, every inch the princess she had become. But he saw the steel in her spine now, the determination that the evening's humiliation had forged. Margaret might have won this battle, but wars were not won with single gestures, no matter how dramatic. The sapphires continued to catch the light as Margaret stood beside him, playing the role of devoted queen to perfection. But Alexander knew, as surely as he knew his own heartbeat, that this evening would be remembered not for the charity funds raised or the diplomatic relationships strengthened. It would be remembered as the night the palace cracked, when the careful facade of royal unity shattered like crystal on marble. The orchestra played on, couples danced, and conversations gradually resumed their normal flow. But beneath the surface, everyone waited for the next act in this very public drama. Alexander delivered his remarks flawlessly, his voice never wavering, even as he felt the ground shifting beneath the monarchy he had spent his life protecting. When the formal proceedings ended and the guests dispersed throughout the palace's reception rooms, Alexander found himself momentarily alone on a balcony overlooking the gardens. The October air was crisp, clearing his head after the suffocating tension inside. Quite the performance, a voice said behind him. Lord Pemberton, Victoria's husband, and one of Alexander's oldest friends, joined him at the railing, though I dare say not the one anyone expected. No, Alexander agreed quietly. Not at all what was expected. The staff are already talking, Pemberton continued, his voice carefully neutral. By morning, it will be throughout London. By evening, the world. Alexander nodded, accepting the inevitable. The modern monarchy lived in a fishbowl, every gesture analyzed, every glance interpreted. Margaret had to have known what she was doing, the statement she was making. The question was why now, why this way? Catherine, he asked, putting on a brave face. James is with her in the blue drawing room. She's refused to leave, says it would give the wrong impression. Pemberton paused. She's right, of course. To leave now would be to admit defeat. She's stronger than we knew, Alexander mused. She'll need to be. Through the balcony doors, he could see Margaret holding court, the sapphires glittering as she laughed at someone's joke. She had played her card brilliantly, he had to admit. In one gesture, she had asserted her position, claimed her territory, and thrown down a gauntlet that Catherine could not ignore. What will you do? Pemberton asked quietly. Alexander considered the question. What would he do? Demand Margaret return the necklace? That would only escalate the situation, turn a personal conflict into a public spectacle. Ignore it? Impossible now that half of society had witnessed the confrontation. I'll do what kings have always done, he said finally. Endure. Manage. Try to minimize the damage to the institution. And the personal damage? Alexander didn't answer. Some questions cut too deep for words, especially for kings who had learned to bury their hearts beneath duty and protocol. He thought of Catherine's face when she saw the necklace, of Margaret's defiant smile, of the careful balance he had maintained for years now crumbling in a shower of sapphire light. Your Majesty, Lady Pemberton appeared in the doorway, her professional composure intact despite the evening's drama. The Prime Minister is asking for a word. Of course he was. The political implications of tonight's events would ripple far beyond palace walls. Alexander straightened his jacket, adjusted his medals one more time, and prepared to face whatever came next. As he walked back into the ballroom, the sapphires caught his eye once more. Margaret was dancing with the Foreign Secretary now, moving through the steps with practiced ease. Catherine stood near the orchestra, surrounded by well-wishers, but somehow looking utterly alone. The Midnight Star had lived up to its name, Alexander thought grimly. Like its celestial namesake, it had appeared suddenly, in the darkness, brilliant and impossible to ignore. But stars that burned too brightly often heralded change, upheaval, the end of one era and the beginning of another. He caught Catherine's eye across the room and saw his own thoughts reflected there. They both understood that after tonight, nothing would be the same. The careful détente that had existed in the palace, the polite fiction of harmony, had shattered like the crystal champagne flute a waiter had just dropped in the corner. The sound of breaking glass was quickly cleaned up, the shards swept away by efficient staff. But some things once broken could never be fully mended. As Alexander moved to speak with the Prime Minister, he wondered if his reign would be remembered for the treaties signed and the ceremonies performed, or for this moment when a monarchy's perfect facade finally cracked. The gala continued around him, a swirl of color and conversation, diplomatic niceties and social graces. But at its heart sat a darker truth, gleaming blue and white at a queen's throat, a reminder that even in palaces, perhaps especially in palaces, the human heart could be a battlefield where love and power waged their eternal war. The morning after the gala dawned gray and drizzling, matching the mood that had settled over Whitmore Palace like a shroud. Catherine stood at her sitting room window, watching raindrops race down the glass, her reflection pale and drawn after a sleepless night. The pearls from the evening before lay discarded on her dressing table, a sad reminder of how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. Her lady's maid, Sarah, moved quietly around the room, setting out the morning tea service. The woman had been with Catherine since her engagement to James 8 years ago, and her discretion was absolute. Still, Catherine could feel the questions hovering in the air between them, unasked but palpable. The newspapers? Catherine asked without turning from the window. His Royal Highness has them in his study. Your Highness, Sarah replied carefully. He asked that you join him when you're ready. Ready? Would she ever be ready to face what Margaret had unleashed? The palace had strict protocols about jewelry, especially pieces given as personal gifts. For Margaret to have obtained the necklace, someone had to have helped her. The betrayal ran deeper than just the wearing of it. It spoke to allies within Catherine's own household, people she trusted who had chosen the Queen's favor over loyalty to her. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Come, she called, expecting James. Instead, Lady Victoria Pemberton entered, her usually perfect composure showing cracks. "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion. The king has requested your presence in his private study." Immediately, Catherine's stomach tightened. Alexander rarely summoned anyone to his private study, preferring to conduct business in the more formal office spaces. That he wanted to see her there, now, suggested a conversation too sensitive for regular palace walls. "Tell His Majesty I'll be there shortly," Catherine said, already moving toward her dressing room. Whatever was coming, she would face it with her head high. Margaret might have won the opening gambit, but Catherine had learned much about palace warfare in her years as princess. The game was far from over. 20 minutes later, dressed in a simple but elegant day dress, Catherine made her way through the private corridors of the palace. Staff members ducked their heads as she passed, their usual friendly greetings replaced by awkward silence. News traveled fast in the palace. By now, everyone from the head butler to the newest kitchen maid would know about the necklace incident. The king's private study occupied a corner of the palace's oldest wing, its windows overlooking the rose garden where Catherine had walked as a nervous bride-to-be 8 years ago. She paused before the heavy oak door, gathering her composure, then knocked. "Enter." Alexander sat behind his desk, looking every one of his 72 years. The morning light was unflattering, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes and the weariness in his posture. On the desk before him lay several newspapers, their headlines visible even from the doorway. "Palace Drama," "Queen and Princess in Jewelry Scandal" screamed one. "Sapphire Showdown at Royal Gala" declared another. "Sit, please," Alexander said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs before his desk. His voice was kind but tired, the voice of a man who had seen too many crises and grown weary of managing them. Catherine sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She had been rehearsing this moment all night, preparing her words, her defense, her accusations. But, faced with Alexander's obvious exhaustion, the words died in her throat. "I'm sorry," she said instead, surprising herself. "I should have handled it better. I let my emotions stop." Alexander interrupted gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. Your behavior last night was exemplary under circumstances that would have broken lesser women." He stood and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Catherine recognized from countless public appearances. When he was thinking, processing, deciding, Alexander always stood just so. "The necklace was taken from your rooms?" he asked without preamble. "Yes," Catherine confirmed. "From my personal safe. Only 3 people have the combination. Myself, James, and my personal secretary, Mrs. Whitfield." "Mrs. Whitfield, who submitted her resignation this morning," Alexander said heavily, "along with a rather substantial deposit to her bank account that she claims was an inheritance from a distant aunt." The betrayal stung even though Catherine had suspected it. Mrs. Whitfield had been with her for 5 years, had been privy to her most personal moments. To know she had been bought, that her loyalty had a price, hurt almost more than Margaret's public humiliation. "Margaret planned this carefully," Alexander continued, still facing the window. "The timing, the venue, the choice of jewelry, all calculated for maximum impact. The question is why now?" Catherine knew the answer, had known it the moment she saw the sapphires glittering at Margaret's throat. "Because of the documentary," she said quietly. "Because the people love their people's princess more than they respect their queen." Alexander turned then, and Catherine saw something in his eyes that looked almost like pride. "You understand, then? This isn't about a necklace or a petty jealousy. This is about the future of the monarchy, about who represents the crown in the public consciousness." The documentary in question had aired 2 months ago, a celebration of Catherine's charitable work that had captured the public imagination. Images of her comforting sick children, building homes with disaster victims, laughing with veterans. It had painted a picture of a royal family that was accessible, warm, human. The ratings had been extraordinary, the public response overwhelming. And Margaret had been barely mentioned, a footnote in her own kingdom story. "She feels threatened," Catherine said, understanding dawning more fully. "She sees me as trying to replace her." "Are you?" Alexander asked, his gaze sharp despite his fatigue. The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Catherine had never consciously sought to overshadow Margaret, but neither had she dimmed her own light to make the queen appear brighter. She had simply been herself, done the work she felt called to do, loved the people she was meant to serve. "I'm trying to serve the crown in the way I best know how," she said finally. "If that threatens Her Majesty, I'm sorry for it. But I won't apologize for caring about people, for showing them that the monarchy can be both dignified and compassionate." Alexander returned to his desk, settling heavily in his chair. "No, you shouldn't apologize for that. God knows this institution needs the warmth you bring to it. But we also need to manage this situation before it tears the palace apart." He opened a drawer and withdrew a velvet box, setting on the desk between them. Catherine recognized it immediately. The original case for the Midnight Star. "The necklace will be returned to you," Alexander said firmly. "Margaret has been informed that it was borrowed without proper authorization. She'll find a way to save face, claim it was a misunderstanding, but the necklace is yours." Catherine stared at the box, emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to refuse it, to say the necklace had been tainted by the whole affair. But she understood the symbolism. To reject it now would be to hand Margaret another victory. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, taking the box but not opening it. "There's more," Alexander continued, his voice heavy with the weight of what came next. "Margaret and I will be taking separate residences for the remainder of the winter. She'll move to Balmoral Castle, citing health reasons and the need for Scottish air. You and James will take on increased duties here in London." Catherine's eyes widened. A separation, even couched in diplomatic terms, was unprecedented in the modern monarchy. The implications were staggering. "Your Majesty, surely that's not necessary. The gossip is already at a fever pitch," Alexander interrupted. "At least this way, we control the narrative. Margaret gets her space to be queen without feeling overshadowed. You get to continue your work without constant confrontation, and the monarchy gets a chance to heal from this self-inflicted wound." He looked older in that moment than Catherine had ever seen him, a king weary of managing not just a nation, but a family that seemed determined to tear itself apart. "What about James?" she asked. "This puts him in an impossible position, caught between his mother and his wife." "James is stronger than you think," Alexander said with a slight smile. "He made his choice years ago when he married you against Margaret's wishes. He'll stand by you now, as he should." Catherine thought of her husband, of the way he had immediately come to her side last night, offering silent support when she needed it most. Their marriage might have started as a carefully orchestrated alliance, but it had grown into something real, something worth protecting. "There will be conditions," Alexander continued, returning to business. "Public appearances will be carefully coordinated to avoid overlap. You'll have increased security, as the press attention will be intense. And Catherine," he paused, meeting her eyes directly, "you must be above reproach in everything. Margaret is waiting for you to make a mistake, to prove that you're unworthy of the position you hold. Don't give her that satisfaction." Catherine nodded, understanding the weight of what was being asked. She would need to be perfect, or as close to it as any human could manage. Every gesture would be scrutinized, every word analyzed, every choice dissected by a media hungry for royal drama. "Understand, Your Majesty," she said formally. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Alexander said, his voice warming slightly. "You've brought something to this family that we desperately needed. Authenticity, warmth, a connection to the people we serve. Don't let anyone, not even a queen, make you doubt your value here." A knock interrupted them, and Lord Pemberton entered at Alexander's call. His face was grave as he approached the desk. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," he said with a brief bow. "I'm afraid the situation has escalated. The Telegraph has a source claiming to have details about the necklace, including how it was obtained. They're running it in the afternoon edition unless we can provide a statement that satisfies them." Alexander's face hardened. "Who's their source?" "They won't say, but Reading between the lines, it's someone with intimate knowledge of palace security procedures. Someone high enough to know about the safe combinations and low enough to be bought. Catherine felt sick. The betrayal was spreading, a poison seeping through the palace foundations. How many others had Margaret corrupted in her campaign? Prepare a statement, Alexander ordered. The necklace was temporarily requisitioned for cataloging and insurance purposes. Due to a clerical error, it was included in the Queen's jewelry selection for the gala. The error has been corrected, and all items have been returned to their proper places. Make it boring, Lord Pemberton. So boring that no one wants to read past the first paragraph. Yes, Your Majesty, Pemberton said, but his expression suggested he knew how futile the attempt would be. The press had scented blood in the water. They wouldn't be satisfied with bureaucratic explanations. After Pemberton left, Alexander and Catherine sat in silence for a moment. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing fervor. Somewhere in the palace, Margaret was probably holding her own war council, planning her next move in this dangerous game. Go to James, Alexander said finally. He needs you now. The two of you must present a united front, starting immediately. There's a hospital opening this afternoon. Attend it together, be seen laughing, touching, being the couple the public believes you to be. We are that couple, Catherine said quietly, but firmly. I know, Alexander replied with a sad smile. That's what makes this all so much harder. If this were just palace theatrics, it would be manageable. But there are real feelings involved, real pain being inflicted. That's what makes it so dangerous. Catherine rose to leave, clutching the jewelry box that had started this latest crisis. At the door, she turned back to the man who had become more of a father to her than her own distant parent. Why did you give me the necklace? She asked. You must have known it would cause problems with Margaret. Alexander was quiet for so long Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory and regret. Because you reminded me of someone, he said. Someone who brought light into these dark halls many years ago. Someone who deserved sapphires and so much more, but who I failed to protect from the machinery of royal life. He met her eyes, and Catherine saw decades of regret there. I won't make that mistake again. The necklace is yours, Catherine. Wear it proudly. Catherine left the study with more questions than answers, but also with a deeper understanding of the complex web she had married into. The palace walls held secrets, old griefs, and older regrets that shaped current conflicts in ways she was only beginning to understand. She found James in their private apartment, still in his dressing gown despite the late morning hour. The newspapers were spread across the coffee table, their headlines growing more sensational with each edition. He looked up as she entered, and she saw her own exhaustion mirrored in his face. How bad is it? She asked, moving to sit beside him on the sofa. Bad, he admitted, pulling her close. But we've weathered storms before. We'll weather this one too. Catherine leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his presence. Outside, London was going about its business, unaware that behind palace walls, a queen and a princess were locked in a battle that would reshape the monarchy for generations to come. Your father wants us to attend the hospital opening, she said. Show unity. Then, that's what we'll do, James replied simply. We'll smile and wave and pretend that my mother didn't try to humiliate my wife in front of half of Europe's aristocracy. She's your mother, Catherine said gently. This must be horrible for you. James was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair absently. She stopped being just my mother the day she put on the crown, he said finally. Now she's the queen first, mother second. Last night proved that beyond any doubt. They sat together as the rain continued to fall, two people bound by love and duty, preparing to face a world that would be watching their every move. The sapphire necklace sat in its box on the table, beautiful and cursed, a reminder that in palaces, even gifts of love could become weapons of war. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of obligations and performances, smiles that must not waver, and touches that must seem natural. But first, in this quiet moment, they allowed themselves to simply be Catherine and James, a couple facing a crisis together, drawing strength from each other for the battles ahead. The phone rang, shattering the peace. James answered, his face growing grim as he listened. "Understand," he said finally. "We'll be ready." He hung up and turned to Catherine. "That was Father's private secretary. The Archbishop wants to see us before the hospital opening. Apparently, there are concerns about the state of the royal family that the church feels need addressing." Catherine almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Of course the church would involve itself. Every institution that propped up the monarchy would want to have its say in this crisis. "Then we'd better get dressed," she said, standing and squaring her shoulders. "We have a long day of pretending ahead of us." As she moved toward her dressing room, James caught her hand. "Catherine," he said seriously, "whatever happens, whatever Mother does next, remember that I chose you. I'll always choose you." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. Margaret might have experience and position on her side, but Catherine had something perhaps more powerful, the absolute loyalty of the future king and the love of the people. The battle for the soul of the monarchy had begun with sapphires and spite. Where it would end, none of them could yet say. The Archbishop's residence at Lambeth Palace felt like neutral territory, though Catherine knew better than to trust such impressions. In the game of royal politics, there was no such thing as neutral ground. Every space, every player had allegiances and agendas. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the Archbishop of Canterbury, greeted them in his study with practiced solemnity. At 63, he had the bearing of a man who had counseled the powerful through their darkest moments, his face etched with lines that spoke of secrets kept and burdens shared. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, gesturing to chairs arranged before the fireplace. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." James helped Catherine into her seat before taking his own, a small gesture of courtesy that the Archbishop's sharp eyes didn't miss. Everything was performance now, Catherine realized. Every movement catalogued and interpreted by those trying to read the state of the royal marriage. "Your Grace," James said formally, "I trust this is important enough to delay our hospital visit." A gentle rebuke, diplomatically delivered. The Archbishop had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I assure you, Your Highness, I wouldn't have asked if it weren't crucial." He settled into his own chair, steeping his fingers in that way religious authorities did when about to deliver unwelcome truths. The events of last evening have created concerns among the church hierarchy. Concerns? Catherine kept her voice level, though inside she bristled. "About a piece of jewelry? About the stability of the royal family," Hartwell corrected gently. "The monarchy and the Church of England are inextricably linked, as you well know. When one institution shows cracks, the other feels the tremors." He rose and moved to a side table, pouring tea with movements that seemed deliberately slow, giving weight to his words. "I've had 3 bishops call this morning, worried about what this public display of discord means for the moral authority of the crown." "With respect, Your Grace," James interjected, "family disagreements are hardly unprecedented, even in royal circles. This will blow over, as these things do." "Will it?" The Archbishop handed them each a cup, his eyes grave. "Your mother has already been in contact with certain traditional elements within the church. There are those who feel that perhaps the monarchy has become too modern, too accessible. They see last night's incident as a symptom of deeper problems." Catherine set down her teacup carefully, understanding dawning. "She's building alliances, using the necklace incident as a catalyst to push back against the changes we've been making." "Precisely," Hartwell confirmed. "The Queen has scheduled a private audience with the Council of Bishops next week, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming Easter celebrations, but we both know the real agenda." James's jaw tightened. "And what is the Church's position in this family matter?" The Archbishop returned to his seat, choosing his words with obvious care. "The Church values stability above all. We have thrived for centuries by adapting carefully, slowly, to changing times. What you and Catherine represent, a more open, emotionally available monarchy, is not inherently problematic. But the manner in which change occurs matters greatly." "You want us to back down?" Catherine said, not making a question. I want you to consider a strategic retreat, Hartwell corrected. Take a lower profile for a few months. Let the Queen have her moments of traditional grandeur. Show the establishment that you're not trying to revolutionize the institution overnight. And if we refuse? James asked quietly. The Archbishop's face grew even more solemn. Then you risk a schism not just within the palace, but within the very foundations of British society. The Queen has more support than you might realize, particularly among those who fear change. Push too hard, too fast, and you might find the ground less solid beneath your feet than you imagine. Catherine felt anger rise within her, hot and clarifying. So, we should dim our light to make Margaret more comfortable? Abandon the work we're doing with mental health charities, with homeless veterans, with struggling families, because it makes the Queen look distant by comparison. I'm not asking you to abandon anything, Hartwell said patiently. I'm asking you to be strategic. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years by knowing when to advance and when to consolidate. This is a time for consolidation. This is a time for cowardice. Catherine shot back, then immediately regretted it as hurt flashed across the Archbishop's face. Catherine, James warned quietly, but she was already apologizing. I'm sorry, Your Grace. That was uncalled for. The stress of the situation is entirely understandable, Hartwell finished graciously. You've been publicly humiliated by someone who should protect and support you. Your anger is justified, but anger, however righteous, makes for poor strategy. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgent quality. Margaret has been queen for over 30 years. She has relationships, loyalties, debts owed, and favors to call on that you can't begin to imagine. If you engage in open warfare with her, you will lose, and the collateral damage will extend far beyond personal hurt feelings. Then what do you suggest? James asked, his diplomatic training reasserting itself. A public reconciliation, the Archbishop said promptly. A carefully choreographed display of family unity. Perhaps a joint appearance at Easter services or a shared patronage announcement. Something that shows the public that whatever personal tensions exist, the institution remains solid. Catherine wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Stand next to the woman who had orchestrated her humiliation and smile for the cameras? Pretend that theft and betrayal were mere misunderstandings? She stole from me, Catherine said quietly. She had someone I trusted betray me, took something precious and personal, and wore it like a trophy. And you want me to stand beside her and pretend it didn't happen? I want you to think beyond yourself, Hartwell replied, not unkindly. The monarchy is bigger than any individual, bigger than personal slights or even personal victories. It's a symbol, a continuity that gives millions of people a sense of stability in an unstable world. Symbols can evolve, James said firmly. They must, or they become relics. Evolution, yes. Revolution, no. The Archbishop stood, signaling the meeting's end. I've said my piece. How you proceed is your choice. But know that the Church will not take sides in a public battle between Queen and Princess. We will work to preserve the institution, whatever the personal cost to those within it. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell touched Catherine's arm gently. I knew your mother-in-law when she was young, you know, before the crown changed her. She was warm once, idealistic even. The throne does things to people, Your Highness. It calcifies the heart, makes strategic what should be simple. Don't let your justified anger turn you into what you fight against. Outside, their car waited to take them to the hospital opening. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and oppressive. As they settled into the back seat, James took Catherine's hand. He's not wrong, he said quietly. About Mother's influence, about the risks of open conflict. I know, Catherine admitted, but I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't stand next to her and smile while she wears my jewelry you gave me, as if it means nothing. The necklace has been returned, James reminded her. That particular battle is won. Is it? Catherine turned to face him. She proved she could take it, that she has people in our household who will betray us for the right price. What's next? Our private correspondence? Our personal photographs? Where does it end? James was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. It ends when I'm king, he said finally. When the power shifts and mother becomes the queen mother, a ceremonial position with no real authority. That could be years, decades even, or it could be tomorrow, James said pragmatically. Father isn't young, and the stress of managing this conflict isn't good for his health. We need to be ready for any eventuality. The car pulled up to St. Mary's Hospital, where a crowd had already gathered despite the earlier rain. As their security detail prepared for their exit, Catherine could see the photographers jostling for position, the reporters ready with their questions about last night's drama. How do we do this? She asked. How do we walk out there and pretend everything is fine? We don't pretend everything is fine, James said, straightening his tie. We show them that despite everything, we're united. That's what matters, not mother, not the necklace, not the palace intrigue. Just us doing the work we believe in. The door opened, and the noise hit them like a physical force. Questions shouted, cameras clicking, the controlled chaos of a royal appearance made more intense by scandal. Catherine emerged from the car with practiced grace, her smile in place, her hand finding James's as naturally as breathing. Your Highness, what about the necklace? Will you reconcile with the Queen? Is there truth to the separation rumors? They walked through it all, acknowledging the crowd with waves and nods, but not engaging with the questions. This was the discipline of royalty, the ability to be present but untouchable, visible but protected by an invisible barrier of protocol and poise. Inside the hospital, away from the press, Catherine felt some of her tension ease. This was where she excelled, where the work mattered more than the politics. The children's ward they were opening had been a project close to her heart, funded partially by her own charitable foundation. Your Royal Highness. A small voice piped up, and Catherine turned to see a girl of perhaps 6, wearing a hospital gown decorated with butterflies. You look like a princess. Catherine knelt to the child's level, her smile becoming genuine for the first time that day. And you look like a butterfly about to take flight. What's your name? Emma, the girl said shyly. Are you sad? You look sad. Out of the mouths of babes. Catherine felt James's hand on her shoulder, steady and supportive. Sometimes grown-ups get sad, Catherine told Emma honestly. But seeing brave butterflies like you makes me feel much better. They spent an hour in the ward, Catherine reading stories while James helped with a puzzle that seemed to have far too many pieces. These were the moments that made the rest bearable, the reminder of why the work mattered more than the palace politics. Dr. Patricia Henley, the hospital's chief administrator, walked them through the new facilities with obvious pride. The equipment you've helped fund will save lives, Your Highness. The new MRI machine alone will help us diagnose conditions we might have missed before. That's why we're here, Catherine said simply. To help where we can. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Henley pulled Catherine aside. I hope you don't mind my saying, but we're all talking about what happened last night. My nurses, the staff, we think it was disgraceful what was done to you. Catherine was touched by the unexpected support. Thank you, but no, please let me finish, Dr. Henley continued. You've done more for healthcare in this country in 5 years than others have done in 30. We see the difference you make, the lives you touch. Don't let them dim your light, Your Highness. We need you too much. As they made their way back through the hospital corridors, Catherine felt a shift in her resolve. The Archbishop wanted strategic retreat. Margaret wanted capitulation. The palace wanted quiet management of an uncomfortable situation. But what about what the people wanted? What about Emma with her butterfly gown and Dr. Henley with her fierce loyalty? I'm not backing down, she told James as they approached the exit. I'll be smart about it, careful, but I won't pretend to be less than I am to make your mother comfortable. I wouldn't want you to, James assured her. But we need to be prepared for what comes next. Mother won't stop with symbolic gestures. She'll escalate until she gets what she wants. And what does she want? You gone, James said bluntly. Or at least so diminished that you're no threat to her vision of what the monarchy should be. The crowd outside had grown during their visit. As they emerged, Catherine noticed something different in the faces looking back at her. Sympathy, support, even anger on her behalf. Someone had made a sign. Team Catherine, it read, with a hand-drawn sapphire beneath. "You see," she said quietly to James as they waved to the crowd. "They know what happened. They're choosing sides. That's what worries me," James replied, his smile never wavering even as concern colored his voice. When the people choose sides against the crown, nobody wins. Back in the car, heading toward their next engagement, Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from her private secretary's replacement. Her heart sank as she read it. "Ma'am, urgent. The Sunday Tribune has photographs from inside the palace. Someone is leaking security footage. His Majesty requests your immediate return." She showed the message to James, whose face darkened. "It's escalating already." As London rushed by outside their windows, Catherine thought about the Archbishop's warning, about thousand-year institutions, and the danger of moving too fast. But sometimes she reflected institutions needed shaking. Sometimes the very foundations that seemed so solid were actually riddled with rot, needing not gentle evolution, but dramatic renovation. The battleground was becoming clear. Not just a conflict between two women or even two visions of monarchy, but a fundamental question about what the crown meant in the modern age. Could it remain a distant symbol of continuity, or must it become something more human, more connected to the people it claimed to serve? The sapphires had been merely the opening shot. As they turned through the palace gates, past protesters and supporters alike, Catherine understood that the real war was just beginning. And despite everyone's warnings, despite the very real dangers ahead, she found herself almost eager for it. Let Margaret have her bishops and her traditions. Catherine had something potentially more powerful, the hearts of the people and the courage to fight for them. The question was whether that would be enough when the full weight of the establishment came crashing down upon her. Only time would tell, but as she climbed the palace steps with James at her side, Catherine made a silent vow. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same grace she had shown at the gala, but also with a steel that Margaret had perhaps not counted on. The people's princess would not go quietly. Not anymore. The security office in the basement of Whitmore Palace hummed with tension. Banks of monitors showed feeds from throughout the palace complex. The modern surveillance system, a jarring contrast to the ancient stones that surrounded it. Catherine stood beside Colonel Marcus Webb, head of royal security, watching grainy footage that made her blood run cold. "There," Webb pointed to a timestamp on the screen. 2:47 a.m., 3 nights before the gala. Someone accessed your apartment using an authorized keycard. The figure on screen was wrapped in a dark coat, face carefully turned away from cameras, but the gait was familiar. Catherine's stomach turned as recognition dawned. "That's Mrs. Whitfield," she said quietly. But she's not trying to hide. She knows where the cameras are. She's deliberately avoiding giving us a clear facial shot, which suggests she had help, Webb confirmed grimly. "Someone with intimate knowledge of our security protocols. We've found 17 minutes of footage missing from the archive, professionally deleted. What you're seeing is from a backup system that few people even know exists." James stood rigid beside her, his face a mask of controlled fury. "How many people have access to that level of the security system?" 12, Webb replied, "including myself, the deputy chief, and members of the Queen's personal protection detail." The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just Margaret taking advantage of an opportunistic betrayal. This was a coordinated operation using the palace's own security apparatus against them. "The photographs the Tribune claims to have," Catherine asked, "do we know what they show?" Webb pulled up another screen, this one showing email intercepts. "They're being cagey, but from what our press office can gather, they have images from inside your personal apartment. Private moments, Your Highness. Nothing salacious, but intimate. Personal." Catherine felt violated in a way that went beyond the theft of the necklace. Her home, her sanctuary within the palace, had been comprehensively breached. How many times had someone been in their rooms while they slept? What else had been taken, copied, photographed? "We need to sweep everything," James ordered. "Every room, every device. And I want Mrs. Whitfield found and questioned." "She's disappeared," Webb admitted. "Left the country this morning on a flight to Switzerland." We're working with local authorities, but he shrugged, the gesture saying everything about the likelihood of cooperation when dealing with wealthy fugitives in Swiss bank's favorite nation. Alexander entered the security office, his face grim. Despite the early hour, it was barely 7 a.m., he was immaculately dressed, every inch the king, even in crisis. "Leave us," he commanded. Webb and his staff filed out immediately, leaving just the family. "The Tribune will publish in 6 hours unless we provide them with something more newsworthy," Alexander said without preamble. Margaret has refused to intervene, claiming she has no influence over the press. "Of course she hasn't," Catherine said bitterly. "This serves her purposes perfectly. Humiliate me publicly, invade our privacy, make me seem like a security risk who can't even protect her own belongings." "There's more," Alexander said heavily. He moved to the window, looking out at the narrow slice of garden visible from the basement level. The Prime Minister called. There are concerns at the highest levels of government about the stability of the monarchy. Questions about whether personal dramas are compromising national security. "That's absurd," James protested. "One stolen necklace doesn't threaten the realm." "No, but the systematic subversion of palace security does," Alexander countered. "If we can't protect a princess's jewelry, how can we protect state secrets? That's the question being asked in Westminster." Catherine sank into a chair, the weight of the situation crushing down on her. This was bigger than she had imagined, the tentacles of Margaret's plot extending far beyond personal humiliation. "What do you need from us?" she asked quietly. Alexander turned from the window, his expression softening slightly. "I need you to be smarter than they expect. Margaret believes you'll either crumble under the pressure or lash out emotionally. Do neither. We're going to turn this crisis into an opportunity." He pulled out a folder, spreading documents across the security desk. "A full review of palace security protocols, led by you, Catherine. Use this breach as justification to modernize everything. Access controls, personnel vetting, surveillance systems. Make it a crusade for protecting the monarchy in the 21st century." "You want me to investigate myself?" Catherine asked, seeing the clever deflection. "I want you to be the solution, not the victim," Alexander corrected. "Take control of the narrative. You're not the princess who lost a necklace. You're the one who exposed critical security flaws and fixed them." James was nodding slowly. "And Mother can hardly object to improving security without seeming to endorse the breach itself." "Precisely." Alexander's smile was sharp. "We'll announce it this afternoon, preempting whatever the Tribune plans to publish. Catherine will chair a comprehensive review, reporting directly to me. We'll frame it as her taking responsibility and showing leadership." "What about the photographs?" Catherine asked. "If they publish private images—" "They won't," Alexander said with certainty. "I've had a word with their publisher. Reminded him about certain regulations regarding privacy and the public interest. They'll run the story, but no images that could be considered truly invasive. We'll weather some embarrassment, but nothing catastrophic." A knock interrupted them. Webb peered in apologetically. "Your Majesty, urgent development. We found something in the deleted footage." They followed him to another monitor, where a technician had been working to recover the missing segments. The image was degraded, but visible, a figure in Margaret's distinctive profile, standing in Catherine's dressing room at 3 a.m., holding the sapphire necklace up to the light. "My God!" James breathed. She went herself. The Queen of England, sneaking through the palace like a thief in the night, stealing from her daughter-in-law. The image was damning, devastating, undeniable. "Delete it," Alexander ordered immediately. "Father," James started to protest. "Delete it," Alexander repeated firmly. "That footage dies here, understood? Everyone in this room is bound by the Official Secrets Act. This recording never existed." Catherine understood, even as her heart raged against it. To release such footage would destroy not just Margaret, but the monarchy itself. The Queen as common thief. The institution would never recover from such a blow. "So she wins," Catherine said flatly. "She violates our home, steals from us, orchestrates our humiliation, and we protect her because to do otherwise would bring down the crown itself." "No," Alexander said firmly. She doesn't win, but we fight with different weapons. He turned to Webb. Colonel, I want Catherine to have full access to all security protocols for her review. And, I mean all, including the Queen's personal arrangements. If we're modernizing everything. Webb's eyes widened slightly at the implications. Access to Margaret's security arrangements meant access to her movements, her contacts, her vulnerabilities. It was a subtle counterattack, but potentially devastating. Furthermore, Alexander continued, effective immediately, the Prince and Princess of Wales will have their own dedicated security team, reporting directly to them rather than through the central palace structure. We can't have conflicts of interest compromising their safety. It was a masterstroke, Catherine realized. In one move, Alexander was giving them independence from Margaret's influence while framing it as a necessary security measure no one could argue against. The Archbishop won't like this escalation, James warned. The Archbishop will appreciate that we're handling this internally rather than through the press, Alexander countered. Now, let's prepare for the announcement. Catherine, you'll need to be word perfect. This is your moment to show them who you really are, not a victim, but a future queen who protects the institution even when it fails to protect her. As they left the security office, Catherine's mind was already working through the possibilities. She had been handed a weapon disguised as a burden, authority wrapped in the cloak of responsibility. Margaret had overplayed her hand, and now Catherine had the means to systematically dismantle her power base under the guise of modernization. You're being very clever, she told Alexander as they walked through the palace corridors. I'm being a king, he replied simply. Protecting the crown sometimes means protecting it from itself. Margaret has forgotten that her power derives from the institution, not the other way around. You haven't forgotten that, have you? No, Catherine assured him. But I also haven't forgotten that institutions must serve people, not the other way around. Good, Alexander said with a slight smile. Keep that balance, and you make a fine queen one day. Lose it, and you'll become another Margaret, stealing jewelry in the night to prove a point no one remembers anymore. 2 hours later, Catherine stood before a hastily assembled press conference in the palace's blue drawing room. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy suit that projected authority, her hair pulled back severely, minimal jewelry except for her wedding rings, and a simple pair of pearl earrings. The sapphire necklace remained locked in a safe, too loaded with meaning to wear publicly now. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice clear and steady despite the churning in her stomach. Recent events have highlighted vulnerabilities in our palace security systems that cannot be ignored. While no significant breach occurred, the fact that unauthorized access to private royal residences was possible is unacceptable. Cameras clicked frantically as she outlined the comprehensive review she would be leading. She spoke of modernization, of bringing the palace into the 21st century, of protecting not just the royal family, but the dedicated staff who serve them. It was a masterful performance, turning victimhood into leadership, crisis into opportunity. Some have asked, she continued, allowing a slight smile, why I, as someone who experienced these security lapses firsthand, should lead this review. I believe that give me unique insight into the vulnerabilities we must address. Who better to strengthen our defenses than someone who knows exactly where they failed? Questions erupted as she finished, but Catherine had been well prepared. She deflected inquiries about the necklace with talk of items temporarily misplaced due to inadequate tracking systems. She redirected questions about palace tensions toward the importance of institutional unity in addressing security challenges. Is it true the Queen has moved to Balmoral? One reporter shouted. Her Majesty is taking a brief rest in Scotland, as she often does this time of year, Catherine replied smoothly. She has expressed her full support for this security review and looks forward to its findings. The lie tasted bitter, but it was necessary. The public face of unity had to be maintained even as the private war intensified. As the press conference ended, and she made her way back to her apartments, Catherine found James waiting in her study. He had watched the conference on television, and his expression mixed pride with concern. You were brilliant, he said, pulling her into an embrace. But, this is just the beginning. Mother won't take this quietly. I'm counting on it, Catherine replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Every move she makes now will be documented, recorded, analyzed by my security review. She's given me the keys to her kingdom without realizing it. You're learning to think like her, James observed, and it wasn't entirely a compliment. Catherine pulled back to look at him. I'm learning to survive her. There's a difference. But, even as she said it, she wondered if that difference would hold. The palace had a way of changing people, of turning idealists into pragmatists, and reformers into the very thing they had fought against. She thought of Alexander's warning about Margaret having once been warm and idealistic before the crown calcified her heart. Promise me something, she said to James. If I ever become like her, if I ever sneak through the palace stealing from our daughter-in-law to prove some petty point, stop me. Remind me of who I used to be. You won't become her, James said firmly. You're too strong for that. But, as Catherine looked out at the palace grounds, at the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of power plays and betrayals, she wasn't so sure. The crown had a way of winning in the end, of transforming those who wore it or stood close to it. The question was whether she could change the institution before it changed her. The sapphire necklace might have been returned, but the real theft was just beginning. The slow, systematic stealing of idealism, warmth, and humanity that the palace performed on all who entered its orbit. Catherine's challenge wasn't just to win the war against Margaret, but to emerge from it with her soul intact. Time would tell if such a victory was even possible within the gilded cage of Whitmore Palace.